I think we'll start with Joe, and we're going to just get started with just kind of some background for those of you who don't know as much about Dr. Sue, as she's called. So we're going to start with a little bit about her. So I'll let Joe begin.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me okay? Students always have told me I've got a big mouth, so I want to make sure everybody hears me. Thank you all for coming here. This is really a great celebration, as it is every year, and I will just tell you flat out that this is a woman that I am madly in love with and have been for many years. I would wake up frequently at 3 o'clock in the morning when I was writing the book. And as I always used to tell my students in these really in-depth writing classes when we were taking on Pine Ridge or What It's Like to Be Black in Lincoln, the art of writing and telling a story is critical. It's the DNA that is shared. Good writing and good music is a tight fit. And that's a point I wanted to make to them. Good music is about beat, rhythm, cadence, syncopation. Good writing is about beat, rhythm, cadence, syncopation. And there would be a sentence rattling around in my head at 3 o'clock in the morning that I'd written 12 hours earlier, and it was a half an octave off. It's a sentence I wanted it to sound like Luciano Pavarotti. And the more I would grind my teeth and lay in bed, it started to sound like Roseanne Barr singing the Star-Spangled Banner. I defy anybody in this room to sleep through that. And I didn't. I owed it. I owed my best cadence, rhythm, syncopation to this woman because there has never been anyone like her. One of the things you have to do when you're telling a story is you have to provide perspective and context. If you don't provide the historical context, if you don't understand the water she was swimming in, you don't understand the story. It's like riding a bicycle with flat tires. It could be a much better journey if there were air in the tires, and it's a much better journey in telling her story if you understand the historical context of the period and the tide that this woman was swimming against. In the last quarter of the 19th century, to use a specific example of what I'm talking about, the Victorian era, women were held in such low esteem, it's shocking when you actually go back through the medical literature. The bar for white women was set about a quarter of an inch off the ground in the last quarter of the 19th century. Native women were invisible. They didn't exist. Let me just read. I don't want, when I give these kind of talks, I don't want the audience to take my word for it. Because I really did a lot of research into what was the mindset. I need to establish the context and perspective of this woman's life so you understand. You can't appreciate her victory unless you understand the tide that she was swimming against. So with your permission, let me just read a snatch of what I'm talking about to establish the strength of the tide that Susan LaFlesche was swimming against, and then we'll move on to give you some highlights of her career once she surmounted that tide. This is a little ditty from the 1874 issue of the Journal of the Anthropological Society of London, and I quote, "During menstruation, women suffer under a languor and depression which disqualify them from thought or action." Oh, it gets worse. "And render it extremely doubtful how far they can be considered responsible human beings while the crisis endures. In intellectual labor, man has surpassed, does now, and always will surpass woman for the obvious reason that nature does not periodically interrupt his thought and activities," end quote. And these weren't the knuckle draggers and the cavemen. These were the Stephen Hawkings of the era. These were the leading bright lights. Now, you flip that over and get to the American side of things, you will read article after article that purports to show that man, without any argument, is superior because he is eminently large-brained. Men have bigger brains than women, was the currency, the medical currency of the last quarter of the 19th century, so therefore, of course, they're smarter. Now, I'm not a trained sociologist or scientist, but I believe I could take a random pool of contemporary male species and selectively pick 10 right off the bat that would show just the opposite. No. We are not superior in any way. We should just give over the mantle, the baton, to the larger brain females and let them run the world for a while. But it's important to understand. It's important that white women in Connecticut who had all kinds of wealth and connections and resources got nowhere. And yet, against this tide, emerging from a remote, isolated northeast corner of the Great Plains in a country that had been 113 years old but had never had a native physician. And out comes this 23-year-old girl from the Omaha tribe, walks across the stage in Philadelphia on March 14th, 1889, and becomes, 113 years later, the first Native American physician, male or female, in the history of her country. And it's absolutely remarkable achievement in her class of 38 that included women from all over the world, because this was the only medical college in the world, in the freaking world, in which a woman could walk in the front door and 3 years later walk out the back door with a medical degree. So Susan sat next to people from Damascus, Syria, from Tokyo, from New Delhi. But on March 14th, 1889, at 11 o'clock in the morning, when she walked across that stage, she not only became the first Native American doctor in American history, she was the valedictorian of her class. She was born in a buffalo hide teepee during the annual summer buffalo hunt, June 17th, 1865, in the northwest corner of Nebraska. 23 years later, she walks across the stage in Philadelphia and gets her medical degree. And despite all of these overtures to stay on the East Coast, stay in Hartford, stay in Boston, stay in New York, you can have a Victorian home with gingerbread trim, servants, go to concerts, concertos, poetry readings. She didn't listen to any of it. She just wanted to get on the train, get back to her beloved Omaha Indian people, and take care of them, which she did for the rest of her life. She did everything for her people. She was their doctor, and it wasn't just the native people, it was all the white people in the area as well, in Pender, in Decatur, in all the border towns, Bancroft, anybody who needed help, she was there for them. She taught Sunday school. She created this very complex bicultural identity in which she was able to take the best of the white world and merge it with the best of the native world and walk this bicultural tightrope for 45 years and never fall off, which is a very difficult thing to do then and now. So she came back. She took care of all of the people in her community. Age 24 now, she had 1,244 patients scattered across 1,350 square mile reservation. They were all, do you know any doctors who have 1,244 patients? Do you know any doctors who had to go service them in a buckboard? This was before Google Maps. So finding just where that house was with a 14-year-old girl curled up in a corner on the dirt floor dying of tuberculosis required an entire day. She would do it day after day, month after month, year after year. And so she became something very special to her entire community. She got rid of the traditional communal drinking cup because it spread disease. She encouraged everybody to put screen doors on their houses to keep the flies out, to pour kerosene in the corners to kill the flies, which spread disease. She taught Sunday school. She presided at graveside ceremonies. She went to Christian celebrations. She went to traditional Native American celebrations. She brought in pianists who provided music. She started a children's library. This is just an utterly remarkable woman in every sense of the word. And then on January 8th, 2013, she realized her lifelong dream. On that day, and you're going to hear a lot more about this over the lunch hour, Susan LaFlesche opened the first Native American hospital on an American Indian reservation, January 8th, 1913, in the history of the country. And it opened on that day 39-room hospital, modern in every sense of the word, without a single public tax dollar being used to build this hospital. She raised all the money herself, $9,000 to build this hospital. So instead of going out for the entire day and seeing one family, she could now turn right when she walked out her door in Walt Hill, Nebraska, and walk 5 blocks and see 20 patients. Just an utterly remarkable woman. Now, I need to shut up because I can go on like this far too long, but we will take a pause and we will hear some questions and thoughts, and then we're going to hear, this is the deal. Are there any lawyers in the audience? Good. We can just have our own oral contract that we're going to chat up here for a number of more minutes, and then that will be our obligation, and then we will have an oral contract in which you will ask the most intelligent questions this room has ever witnessed. Is it a deal? Deal? All right. Good enough. Oh, thank you. Okay.
I'm just going to, I'm going to just ask a few follow-up questions. Is that better? Okay, all right. I don't like hearing my voice in the big room, I guess. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about her father, and you know, it seemed like he was very much somebody who helped her to, you know, end up becoming the doctor that she became. But, you know, there was very much kind of, because there was a bicultural world that he was straddling at a very difficult time. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about his role.
Joseph LaFlesche had 4 daughters. The oldest was Suzette, also known as Bright Eyes. You could make the argument, I think, pretty convincingly that this was the single most accomplished and perhaps interesting Native American family in the country. Now that's going to open up all kinds of grenade tosses, but I'm ready. Joseph LaFlesche had these 4 amazing daughters and a son. And the oldest daughter, Suzette LaFlesche, was the first Native American woman to go off and vigorously advocate that Native Americans should be considered citizens in the lands that they had lived on for, just this little 10,000-year period. She went to Boston, up and down the East Coast. She went to England. She went to Ireland, crusading for Native American rights. The youngest, Susan, became the first Native American doctor. His son, Francis, became the nation's first Native American ethnographer, attached to Harvard University. Joseph LaFlesche was the last recognized chief of the Omaha. His father was French, and he passionately believed, as a father, looking ahead, the best thing he could do for his beloved daughters and his son was to get them an education. That was the key to the castle. But not to lose their native identity in the process. A very tricky thing to pull off. But he believed this passionately, and it was very divisive within the Omaha tribe. So his followers moved to one part of the reservation, and the traditionalists who believed in keeping things in the native way and the native customs, who really didn't want anything with the white way of looking at things, owning land. Who could own the land? That's an insane concept. They established their own village, and they mockingly referred to Joseph's as the village of the make-believe white man. So there was a split in the tribe. But Joseph was resolute in his belief that these children needed an education. And he was, in many ways, a visionary in that sense. And all of his daughters did get an education. Susan, at age 14, was put on a train. Imagine being 14 years old in 1879 in Nebraska, and your Native American father takes you to Omaha and puts you on a train, and you resurface in Elizabeth, New Jersey, to a private girls' school. Joseph wanted her to get that education. And she did. And then she went to Hampton. He put her on a train and she went to Hampton University in Virginia, graduated number 2 in her class. Then she comes back and he puts her on another train and she goes to the Women's Medical College in Pennsylvania, where she becomes a doctor. He was, I would argue, a true visionary. And one of the things that you have to understand, again, this idea of creating the context and the perspective from which this woman emerges is so important in order to embrace her story. And she had misogynistic barriers to overcome. She had racist barriers to overcome. She had cultural, tribal barriers to overcome. And she had physical landscape limitations. 1,244 patients across 1,300 plus square miles in the dead of winter, and she's 24 years old. And before that, she is in her 3rd year of medical college in Philadelphia. She has to take an anatomy class. Now there are something, and Taylor may have the exact, 570-ish federally recognized tribes in America? 575, okay. But who's counting? Taylor is, thank you. And I would guess that among all 575 tribes, that this is a cardinal virtue. Susan gets to her 3rd and final year of medical school, and she has to take an anatomy class. She has to cut up bodies. You don't do that in the native world. And I would guess that holds true for most, if not all, of those 575 tribes. It certainly held true for the Omaha. And her father, Joseph, was furious, livid, outraged that his daughter was going to spend weeks carving up bodies, which meant the spirit of that body would always be roaming the world hopelessly and helplessly and would never be able to come home. How could you do that? He would ask her. And how could she not do it if she wanted to be a doctor? Those are probably conflicts that don't exist now. But this was a crisis point in her life, with her father vehemently sticking to the cultural values of the tribe, even though he fully supported his daughter being a doctor, and Susan having to balance going against her beloved father, but weighing that against the good she could do for all of the fathers. And that's probably not happening now. It's probably not happening now. So.
I think we better move to the next, yes.
Q&A?
So we're going to play a video. I interviewed, unfortunately, Dr. Wescott wasn't able to join us, but I was able to meet with her on Zoom and we live in a Zoom world, and so I was able to interview her. She does a pretty good job of introducing herself, but she is, I think that it's really interesting just from what we've heard from Joe just now. Let's see here. Oh, here we go. We're going to do it.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Hold on, before I get started. And unfortunately, my computer is not letting me access my introduction, but she's a professor at the University of Nebraska, I understand. We had a little trouble even, I had to reschedule with her. She was she's an Alaska native, and she had been she was just there visiting with her family, and she's going to talk a little bit about, at the very beginning here of our interview, about her trip up there. But I think it's just so interesting coming out of the discussion of Dr. Sue and Dr. LaFlesche that we just heard, that history, just hearing about how important it is to find those people who are able to step up and be doctors for their communities. And I think that Dr. Wescott really talks in our interview here really well. And this is, I think, her goal and her mission is to find the other Dr. Sues that are still with us out in the world, in Indigenous communities around the country, who might be able to bring healthcare to their communities. So anyway, I'm gonna let her do the talking, because she's a wonderful woman and very articulate about some of these issues. So let me get her going.
Dr. Wescott, I really appreciate your time. I wonder if you might just be able to start by telling me a little bit about your own story of your own childhood and kind of how that story compelled you to go into medicine.
Well, thanks. That's a great question. So, I'm an Athabascan from Fairbanks, Alaska, and I was just home. I will share this picture again. So this is the family cabin, and you can't see it, but there's a little trail to where the outhouse was. So, it's Alaska, and some of the things that I learned in Alaska is you are not necessarily going to get the supplies that you want, and there isn't necessarily anybody coming to help. So that's where I learned, and it's kind of a MacGyver approach to everything. And so, you figure it out. We don't have the parts yet to secure the porch, so let's put some birch stumps up there. I mean, you make it work. And that isn't necessarily why I went to medicine. It's really because I felt like I was a health educator with a master's degree, and I felt like I didn't understand the diseases, so how could I really explain them or convince someone to make different choices if I didn't understand what was happening? So, but it's also that sense of people are trying to do the best that they can with the information that they have and the supplies that they have. And the way I approach improving health is saying, okay, you may not get exactly the supplies you want, especially if you live in a food desert, but how can you make the most of what you have?
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that I thought I would let you talk a little bit about sort of the history of Indian health in our country. I know healthcare was often promised as kind of part of our U.S. treaties with a lot of indigenous communities, and it was, in exchange for land. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, how well those promises have been kept, and just that history of our relationship, with tribes and federal government there.
Well, there's actually a book called Promises to Keep, and they haven't been fully kept. And the slightly cynical view of why you include healthcare in a treaty in exchange for land, because that's not really a standard provision that you would expect to see in a treaty. Again, the cynical view is that it's because the federal government wanted a legal ability to quarantine Indians if there were epidemics. And so, it's coming full circle, because actually the Indian Health Service did fairly well with vaccines for COVID. They're very quiet about these things, and the data is hard to come by, but that's a full circle moment. I think there were a lot of examples of very poor decisions and untrustworthy actions made by the feds. I think it was an Admiral Amherst who gave the smallpox blankets to a tribe in Massachusetts. So there's certainly a lot of history there to unpack when it comes to how that long shadow of treaties casts dispersions on today, is that there isn't as much trust as there could be, and we need to re-earn that trust if we're going to work with tribes, because they are sovereign nations. And I was just talking with a friend in Alaska who regularly has to explain that tribes are sovereign nations within the Alaska Native Medical Center. So, it's constantly an issue.
Yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about and just compare the Indian Health Service care compared to healthcare systems elsewhere in the United States. Because I know that in some ways, Indian Health Service, it is actually a system, at least, unlike the United States healthcare system is not as systematic as it could be. So there's
Mhm.
ways in which maybe it's better, but there's a lot of ways in which I know that it's really lacking in funding and things like that. I wonder
Mhm.
if you can just kind of compare the two systems.
Well, I don't think you can call either of them a system. So there's something called 93-638, which is a law that passed in 1975, which paved the way for tribes to take over their own care from Indian Health Service. So the Navajo Nation, the Alaska Native Medical Center, a lot of other tribes have taken over their care from the Indian Health Service. So you can't call the whole thing a system because you do have these pockets where the tribe is managing and making their own decisions about healthcare. So, uh, and obviously the US does not have a healthcare system. We have a patchwork of really haphazard care. So nonetheless, I think the better way to look at it, because data is pretty sparse, uh, the National Center for Health Statistics put out a report in August 2022 about the impact of the pandemic on life expectancy. And Native Americans were the most impacted, but really buried in the data, if you look at it, life expectancy of a Native child born today would be 10 years less than a white newborn and 16 years less than an Asian. So think about that, 16 years, uh, you might miss a grandchild or a great grandchild or multiples because the life expectancy is so much shorter. So that is uh, experience and wisdom that isn't being shared across generations because of that very shortened life expectancy. So we clearly haven't succeeded in living up to treaty promises and bringing what I like to call health. I like to use the American Medical Association definition of health equity is optimal health for all. We clearly haven't reached that for the first people of this country.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of that has to do with just a serious lack of funding in the Indian Health Service. Can you talk a little bit about the that problem of just why it is that the federal government hasn't kept up with making sure that Indian Health Service is funded well?
Well, I can't answer that. I can tell you that there is good data out there, at least pre-pandemic, for how much underfunded, and it's not like 5%, it's like 30% underfunded. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's significant. And I think part of the problem too, though, is even if you had a full budget, it's hard to uh, if you get physicians. So pre-pandemic, and really physicians is where the good data is, but really at all levels of healthcare this is true. So Indian Health Service pre-pandemic had a 20 to 24% vacancy rate for physicians. So imagine trying to treat patients when you're down one fifth to one quarter of key decision makers in healthcare. So there's just there's a myriad of problems, and I think a lot of it is related to just the general issue of trying to get physicians to rural areas. And I know Dr. Starita is going to talk about Dr. Susan, and she really we could use 20 Dr. Susans in Nebraska today. So the issues that were uh, of difficulty getting care in rural areas in her day are still very much present today.
Yeah. And, I know that here in Wyoming on the Wind River Reservation, there's two tribes, the Northern Arapaho and the Eastern Shoshone. And the Northern Arapaho tribe has adopted a 638 contract. And I know that the Eastern Shoshone is looking into that. And it seems like that is a growing movement. Can you talk about the 638 contract and how that is helping with some of these shortfalls in Indian healthcare?
Yeah, so it's really an amazing thing because if the tribes can sort out, we really need is a good financial person because third party billing is critical. Um, but that core amount of funds that of Indian Health Service dollars that would have gone to the tribe had they not 638'd, and yes, it is a verb, or taken over their own care, then you can, if you're good at billing and you figure out, enrolling people who are qualified for Medicare or Medicaid, for instance, and billing for those visits, then if you're able to have any revenue above and beyond costs, then that can go to things that the Indian Health Service usually doesn't prioritize, like substance abuse treatment. So it really is opens up a world of opportunities if the tribes can get the finances right.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about why it's important to encourage Native American students to start pursuing medical careers and how it is that you have been really working on that effort.
So we're so under, and I always hesitate to answer these questions because the data is not as quality as we would want. And I use the example of Dr. Susan, who had some French ancestry and several tribes, including the Omaha. Under the current Department of Education race reporting rules, she would not have been reported as a Native med student.
Wow.
Because she was more than one race, and that just gets put in a bucket of two or more races. And so it's a very complex, race can be extremely complex in the US, how people see their identity in terms of race and ethnicity, and our data collection is not captured even a fraction of that complexity. However, when you do look, we're amongst the most underrepresented of all races in the US in healthcare and specifically in medicine. So, what I think of, and I've only seen one like New York Times article some time ago about this, and somebody needs to really study this because it's important. About half of US medical students have an immediate family member who's a physician. So that gives you a huge advantage to somebody to guide you through all the unwritten rules, probably even resources to, because it's so expensive to pursue a medical degree. And all of the programs that I've been involved in, pathway programs to get more natives into medicine or healthcare in general, is essentially trying to replace that family member that they probably don't have who's in medicine. So that's, it's not just, oh, we were going to give you some books to study for the MCAT. Like, you've got to help them through everything because whom they're competing against for spots probably has a coach within the family. So, it's not, these programs aren't cheap. It costs a lot of money, but you're not going to be able to just throw a few dollars at this and get more Native students. You really have to pull in a full system of support.
Yeah. I wonder if you can talk a little bit, and you have already started to, how the pandemic really did test those Indian health clinics. I know that they really did here in Wyoming, and just what you saw, across the country in terms of how a lot of those health clinics stepped up to handle that, what their priorities were, and what they learned through the process of dealing with that pandemic.
Well, I think it was really tough at the beginning. The Navajo Nation was especially hard hit, and Doctors Without Border had never been to the U.S. until this COVID pandemic, and one of the places that they went was the Navajo Nation. So there was definitely a lot of scrambling, but I think for whatever reason, and I haven't gotten a good answer on this from the Indian Health Service, they're not real interactive. They just do their thing, but they did a spectacular job with the vaccines. And I think it was the Blackfoot Nation that is a good example of tribes sharing vaccine doses with neighbors. So they let Canadians, and there's a picture of a whole line of cars on this road. Just think of cars all the way to the mountains of Canadians waiting to get vaccines from the Blackfoot Nation. But a lot of tribes didn't prioritize just by age. They're like, okay, who are our traditional speakers? Let's prioritize them. So there's a lot of ways that tribes really sorted out what's important to us, and they did a very good job with the vaccines.
Yeah. I think that maybe to kind of start to wrap up, I just was wondering if you might talk a little bit about why maternal and infant health is especially important to Indigenous communities, and how that is something that has been kind of becoming more and more of a priority.
Yes. Obviously, you don't survive future generations if you don't take care of pregnant women and newborns. And so there was a fascinating study out of Florida a couple of years ago, and I haven't seen this in the Native community, but it was African American newborns cared for by African American physicians had far less infant mortality than those cared for by physicians of another race. So when you think about placebo effect, which you should always keep in mind when you're looking at healthcare, if you see a doctor who looks like maybe you respond, but newborns are physically incapable of that. And so that is a pure effect. Or you could say maybe the parents respond better to the physician, but newborns really are not capable of understanding race or barely a few inches in front of them. So, this is really an indictment of our lack of ability to really find a way for people to care well for people of another race. That's just, and it's a really shocking result if you think about it in 2022 that we're still having to have these conversations. And so, maternal child health is a priority for a lot of tribes. And I think when you get to those issues, and I haven't actually looked, but probably OB-GYNs are amongst the highest vacancy rate. So, you can't necessarily deliver close to home if there are issues with having physicians who can deliver the baby or handle any complications.
Yeah. Well, I think these are the questions that I had, but I wonder if you can just kind of let me know what I might have missed, and what your sort of your hopes are for going forward with Indigenous health.
One of my favorite things that happened early in the pandemic is pictures of clinic staff at an IHS tribal facility sewing masks for the whole community. We are a very thoughtful group who don't think just about ourselves. We think about the greater community. And so you saw the sharing of vaccines and making masks, things like that. And I think America doesn't appreciate us. America does not appreciate Native communities. their tight-knit, caring nature. And that is something that I hope comes out of the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to talk me through this.
Sure, I appreciate it.
Three audience questions.
Okay.
And then I'll wrap up.
Okay, that sounds good. Sounds like we have time for just like maybe 3 questions. So if anybody would like, and we can pass around a mic.
Oh, thank you.
Joe, how did Susan LaFlesche's father, how did he finance the education for those kids?
He didn't finance the education for the kids. A ever-expanding circle of wealthy white women financed her education. And that's a really complicated story how that all started, but a prominent ethnologist from the Peabody Museum at Harvard, Alice Fletcher, wanted to come west and study native tribes. And she did. She went to Wyoming, as a matter of fact. And what she found in Wyoming was overwhelmingly shocking. This is a woman who was raised in New York and Boston, where she experienced extreme prejudice as a woman. So she figured, oh my God, if I'm being prejudiced in Boston and New York, what must it be like to be a woman in Wyoming, in a native tribe? And what she discovered was it was really cool to be a woman in a native tribe because no decisions were made without consulting the women. If a woman wanted to end her marriage, she simply put her husband's belonging outside the teepee. And when he came back from the hunt and he saw his belongings there, he knew that he was toast. She was absolutely overwhelmed by how female-centric the political structure in Native American tribes were. So she eventually makes her way from Wyoming to the Omaha reservation. And of course, the first thing she's told is, oh, you got to go see Joseph LaFlesche. And so that began, and then Alice Fletcher meets Susan. And like everybody else who meets Susan, she is so struck by this young girl's focus, maturity, intelligence, verbal skills. She spoke 5 languages. And she began to do some downfield blocking for her, and then other women got involved, Alice's friends, and they got her into the private school in New Jersey. They eventually got her into Hampton in Virginia. They eventually got her in to the women's medical college by just knocking down one barrier after another. No, you have to take, this woman is amazing, and they were right, of course. But it was a pretty tight-knit circle of powerful white women who were introduced to Susan at a young age and then kept following her. And every time they would do something to get her into a school, she would just, graduate in the top of her class. So she just kept feeding off of that power that these women had.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there questions?
Any other observations? Yes, sir.
I have a question for Joe or any of the other scholars today, if Charles Alexander Eastman came into any of the orbit of any of these characters?
Yes.
Okay.
And you want to explain who Charles Eastman is?
Well, I'm familiar with his work from the Dark Woods to Civilization, and I know that he wrote about his time being a physician on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation during Wounded Knee.
Charles Eastman was the attending physician during the Wounded Knee Massacre. And Dr. Susan's oldest sister, we've talked about earlier, Suzette, AKA Bright Eyes, she was married to a crusading journalist for the Omaha Daily Herald that would become the Omaha World Herald by the name of Thomas Henry Tibbles. And Thomas Henry Tibbles married Bright Eyes, and they were at Wounded Knee covering the massacre when it happened. They were at the church when the bodies of women and children, many of whom had been shot in the back, were brought into the church. Susan tells the story that she was told by her older sister of a little boy who they kept feeding him soup because he was freezing and starving, and the soup kept pouring out of a hole in his throat where he'd been shot. Just a horrifying scene that her older sister was at. And of course, Susan at that point had just become a doctor. So she was really interested in these stories that she was getting from her older sister, who had always been kind of the preeminent role model for Susan, her older sister, Bright Eyes, who also was the interpreter at the landmark trial of Chief Standing Bear in Omaha in May of 1879. So this is just one hell of a family. and I mean, they sprang from the soil of this state. So these are people we should really embrace and really be proud of.
One last question. Yeah. You can use mine.
What about the other two sisters?
Sorry?
The other two sisters between Suzette and Susan?
Yeah, so one of them, Marguerite, became a very savvy businesswoman. So the hierarchy went Suzette, AKA Bright Eyes, crusader for Native American civil rights and voting rights. And then Marguerite was the second oldest, and she became a very savvy businesswoman. And then the third oldest was Rosalie, and there is a little town on the Omaha Reservation named Rosalie, after Rosalie. And Rosalie was probably the most traditional. She was a mother, and she had 9 children. And Susan was in medical school when Rosalie was producing a lot of children. And if you read the letters, I mean, they're just kind of really hysterical in some ways. Susan just doting on her sister Rosalie, giving her like this minute-by-minute advice of what she'd be doing, how to properly care for the baby. And it really shows the extraordinary care that Susan would have all of her life for her patients, and the depth of her love for her own family. So Rosalie was the one who just kind of stayed put and lived a traditional life, and was getting all of it. She had a really good doctor in the house who really took care of her. And speaking of good doctors in the house, I just wanted to wrap up with, you heard Dr. Wescott, who is absolutely amazing. You know, this country has a lot of issues right now, I would say, a lot of problems and things that aren't going as well as they could, but it's also a country that does things that really nobody else can. And I give you Exhibit A, Dr. Siobhan Wescott, who was born and raised in a 400 square foot cabin with no indoor plumbing in Alaska. They had to use an outhouse in Alaska, 6 people in a 400 square foot cabin with an outhouse. That's how she started life. And she graduated from Harvard Med School. You know, that doesn't happen everywhere. That doesn't happen everywhere. And it's very similar in many ways to Susan, who was born in a Buffalo High teepee and graduates #1 in her class in the only women's medical college in the world. And the other really important point that Dr. Siobhan made is that not that long ago, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic in Nebraska, as you know, is a state, some of you, as you know, is a state comprised of 93 counties. The poorest of those 93 counties is Thurston County. That's the Omaha Reservation. That county, the poorest county with the highest suicide rate, at the height of the pandemic, also had the highest vaccination rate of any of the 93 counties in Nebraska. 83% of the Omaha native population in Thurston County was vaccinated. If you went 2 counties west, all-white county, it was 21%. 21%. And that just underscores a very seminal point that has been true for 10,000 years, that native culture, then and now, is a we-based culture. And on the outside, it's pretty much a me-based culture. And that is a really important distinction. And it's evidenced by 83% vaccination rate. And you all know the problems we had here in Lincoln about trying to get people vaccinated. Those people did not want their 14-year-old child coming back from school and infecting their 83-year-old grandfather or grandmother who lived often in the same house. So they got vaccinated. And they have a very, very low rate of getting COVID. So there's lots of things that we could learn from these people, and if we're smart, still will learn, and making the entire fabric of the country that much richer and stronger. Thank you very much.
Thank you.